Hello, I'm Jeff Helgeson at Heirloom Books, 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. This is the 8th segment in an ongoing Great Books series that I'd like to just take a moment to overview some of previous mentioned aspects of an approach to a text before moving on to the announced topic of today, 4 plays by Aristophanes. In summary, the considerations I've recommended are from 3 distinct perspectives: context, when and under what circumstance a work was created; content, the events, characters, allusions, ideas presented; and craft, the way a piece is written in terms of structure and style. Added to that, I've suggested a series of analytic questions: what a text says, why it might say that, how it's presented, and so what, or what significance does it seem to have. Add in enough cultural literacy to appreciate possible references and allusions, both manifest or surface, and latent or implied levels of expression, as well as literal, moral, psychological, and symbolic possible interpretations of the meaning, and you have a Rubik's Cube for the mental process of reading, thinking about, and seeking to interpret an artifact of a literary work. During the last few segments, I've generally stressed content and craft. So today, I'd like to place some emphasis on context. Although the year in which Aristophanes was born as a citizen of Athens is merely estimated to have been around 444 BCE, when he was somewhere about 18, he won second prize in the annual festival of Dionysus theater competitions, and then continued writing comedic plays for the next 40 years, winning first prize in 427 BCE and at least 3 other times in various competitions. This had been both during the height of Athenian power following the Persian invasions, and then well after the city's 405 BCE defeat by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, during a plague that was spread by overcrowding of refugees within the city and killed its democratic leader, Pericles. Now, this occurred in the wake of a failed expedition against the city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily at the encouragement of the young Athenian general Alcibiades, a nephew of Pericles and student of Socrates, a fact that in 399 BCE may well have contributed to his teacher's execution for corrupting the city's youth, after a period of aristocratic rule and the eventual restoration of democracy. Then, Aristophanes, who was once prosecuted for slander by one of the popularist demagogues he repeatedly satirized, is thought to have died sometime around 14 to 24 years after Socrates, between 385 and 375 BCE. So, what does all this have to do with 50 or so comedic plays, only 11 of which survive, written approximately 2,500 years ago? And the answer, of course, is context. You see, Aristophanes, like so many of today's popular culture satirists, routinely used comedy to attack political and social corruption, as well as the concept of endless war, and such public figures as Euripides and Socrates. In response, Plato, when writing his dialogue, The Symposium, addressing the topic of various types of love, even included Aristophanes along with Alcibiades. In fact, Plato, it's been said, had a copy of Aristophanes' plays with him on his deathbed, and once is supposed to have sent an edition of those works to the king of Syracuse as a kind of analysis of Athenian democracy. Among Aristophanes' plays, the best known, which have survived the past 2,400 years, seem to be The Clouds from 423 BCE and satirizing Socrates, The Birds, an escapist fantasy from the time of the Sicilian disaster around 414 BCE, Lysistrata from 3 years after Alcibiades' recklessness at Syracuse, when, according to the historian Thucydides, the Athenian fleet and army perished from the face of the earth, and The Frogs, 405 BCE, set in Hades, several decades following the death of Aeschylus and shortly after the deaths of both Sophocles and Euripides. Before going into the events depicted within these various plays, however, I feel I need to stipulate a principal distinction between comedy and tragedy, the only two types of theater with which ancient Greeks were familiar, as is made evident by the traditional smiley face and frowny face theatrical masks, tragicomedy, melodrama, soap opera, and serial television drama not yet having been invented. Last time, I explained that in the Poetics, Aristotle had outlined the various components of a literary work for the stage, a single imitative or mimetic action having three parts, beginning, middle, and end, which consists of 6 primary elements: plot, character, thought, diction, music, and spectacle. This was then presented in accordance with the 4 unities of action, character, time, and place. And for tragedy, Aristotle observed that the central character should be a good person of high social status towards whom an audience members would naturally tend to look up, but who possessed a character flaw that affected judgment, provoking emotions of pity and fear among viewers, which would eventually be relieved in a reaction to events that was termed catharsis. With comedy, although most of these elements remain in place, the relationship of the audience to the central character, however, is different. Instead of being someone to be looked up toward, here the members of the audience are in a superior position, largely due to their sense of objectivity and a feeling that in similar circumstances they would not behave in the same manner as the persons represented while dealing with inherently humorous situations. Further observation offered was that tragedy concluded with some form of significant loss, frequently, although not always, death, and comedy ended with gain, very often marriage or at least some form of reconciliation. Then, speaking of Aristotle, there's also the cultural context of philosophy that must be touched upon with respect to the time in which Aristophanes was presenting his plays. You see, beginning in 585 BCE, when Thales of Miletus accurately predicted an eclipse of the sun going beyond the abilities of the wise men of Babylon in Egypt, there began to be an intellectual interest in the reasons behind aspects of physical reality, or the use of reason to discern truth. This led to various interpretations of things, such as the notion that everything was made of water, a liquid, solid, or gaseous substance, or fire, in other words, energy, or, as argued by Democritus, empty space and atoms, meaning in ancient Greek, things that cannot be cut. The problem with these types of speculations, however, was first, that they conflicted with one another, and secondly, they had very little influence upon how human beings might go about living their daily lives. As a result, a new form of philosophy, love of wisdom, developed, Sophism, which held that there was no such thing as absolute truth, and that all things were relative to human perception, or that man is the measure of all things, with a constantly changing, largely agnostic worldview, that the adherents to this interpretation of existence would willingly teach to anyone for a fee. And then, between his birth in 470 BCE and his death imposed by the Athenian state in 399 BCE, along came Socrates, who accepted no payment, but asked people to question everything, especially how they should best live their lives, considering such things as what is justice. In 423 BCE, Socrates, having been declared by an oracle to be the wisest of men, although he claimed that he himself knew nothing and impelled others to, above all things, know thyself, became the subject of Aristophanes' philosophic satire, The Clouds. In the play, a father whose horse-racing son has incurred a large debt for their family decides to seek relief by trying to learn the rhetorical skill of talking one's way out of any situation through becoming a student of Socrates, perhaps especially because he asked for no payment. Approaching the school, the overburdened parent encounters a student who tells him about the masters determining the distance a flea could jump by dipping the insect's feet into warm red wax. And inside he meets Socrates himself, who is hanging in the air, lying in a basket, so that he can contemplate celestial matters, his head in the clouds, one might say, through suspending his judgment. Proving to be a less than stellar pupil, the father eventually abandons his studies in favor of his son, who fares much better, learning quickly to deny the gods and excelling in both right and wrong logic, coming to confound his creditors and evade their claims, and then to physically beat his father, who, when asking why his son would do such a thing, is told that it's because he loves him. Demanding an explanation under the observation of a chorus of clouds, the father is asked if he had ever struck his son while he had been a child. And when he admits having done so, he's asked why, and replies that it had been because of love. Frustrated by the logic of his progeny had learned at that school, the father concludes the play by creating a burn, baby, burn, burn the mother down philosophical inferno, setting the institution on fire, in response to which the cloud chorus proclaims, "Lead out the way, for I think we may have say we have acted out our part very well today." Now, a great many fans of Socrates claim that the clouds represented a slander which may have served to contribute to the philosopher's trial and execution. But if that had been perceived to be the case, Why would Plato, Socrates' principal advocate and defender, have both included Aristophanes in a fairly good-natured way within the symposium, and then kept and distributed copies of his work? Perhaps there can be a fine line between ridicule and a good-humored roast, condemnation, and making a little fun. In fact, somewhat ironically, by contrast, Plato's treatment of Aristophanes often seems to me to be taken far too seriously. I mean, should the comic playwright be accepted literally when, after recovering from a case of hiccups, he claims that love is the result of the gods having feared that round human beings could become too powerful? So they were cut in half, and the attraction people feel toward one another is the result of a kind of recognizing of a lost part of themselves. Seriously? Yet this notion is often accepted at face value and even appears in the 1960s song People. A feeling deep in your soul says you were half, now you're whole. No more hunger and thirst. First, be a person who needs people, and so on and so forth. Anyway, my thought is that Socrates and Plato could probably pretty well take the joke. The birds, first produced in 414 BCE, by contrast to the clouds, is a kind of wish fulfillment play in which two men who are disgusted by the conditions of life in Athens escape to birdland, long before the advent of Charlie Parker. The king there, Epops, convenes an ornithological summit, and all the birds decide to create a new city in the space between heaven and earth, Cuckoo Land, thereby blocking the rising of devotional incense and forcing the gods to either perish from this deprivation or grant the birds a position of celestial glory. The two Athenians themselves become metamorphosized into birds, one marrying a daughter of Zeus, and there is joy in Birdland at the conclusion of the play. Within 3 years after the birds and following the military Sicily, Lysistrata addresses the subject of endless war from the perspective of the home front, when the title character persuades the women of the city to seize the state treasury in the Acropolis and go on strike with regard to having sex with their husbands and lovers, I suppose, until the ongoing conflict has been ended. Although the women of Sparta are also brought into the movement, there are, of course, the challenges of staying union strong when would-be deserters start going man-crazy and try everything from household chores as excuses to return to their homes to faking childbirth. The men of the various warring sides, of course, also suffer greatly from the estrangement after initially dismissing the female strategy, eventually capitulating and sending ambassadors to meet with Lysistrata, suing for peace and a return to the prospect of restoring intimate conjugal relationships. And so, curtain call, cue up the Helen Reddy tune, strong, invincible, in numbers too big to ignore. The frogs, from 405 BCE, then pretty much goes in the opposite direction of the birds. Instead of skyward, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, as well as the stories of Persephone and Orpheus, venturing into the land of the dead with a descent to visit Hades. Sophocles and Euripides have recently died. Aeschylus having passed on about 50 years earlier, and Dionysus, the god to whom the annual theater festivals at Athens are dedicated, has become concerned that there are not any great tragic playwrights left. As a result, along with a servant who seems to have been setting the mold for Cervantes' Sancho Panza in Don Quixote, and of course the Man of La Mancha, the god has disguised himself as Hercules, another descent into Hades character, in order to venture into the underworld and bring back one of the writers. Arriving in the court of the king of the dead, Dionysus learns of a contest in which Sophocles and Euripides are attempting to unseat Aeschylus from his position as the greatest tragic playwright of all time. Now, gracious and probably fully satisfied, having won the Dionysian competitions as many as 24 times, and therefore really having nothing more to prove, Sophocles respectfully withdraws from the contest, and Dionysus is asked to judge the remaining two. The playwrights then make their opening statements, each ultimately agreeing that the shared goal of their work is to make people better, moral purpose combined with pleasure. On the issue of style of expression, diction, music, spectacle, however, the two writers strongly disagree, and Aeschylus suggests a measure of weight in terms of passages from their respective works. When a set of scales is used to objectively assess the evidence, Aeschylus is easily determined to be the winner, and therefore to be the tragedian who Dionysus should bring back from the dead, leaving Euripides, whose plays Aristophanes had frequently criticized for immorality and being a negative influence upon Athenian patriotism, to remain in hell among the dead. Next time, just for the pleasure of it, I'll be swerving into Lucretius' 2,000-year-old poem on the nature of things. I'm Jeff Helgeson, and Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois, and is open 7 days a week from noon